my son Daniel called to invite me to a so-called reconciliation dinner in downtown Boston, I remember gripping the steering wheel with a cautious kind of hope, the kind of fragile optimism that a father carries even after years of disappointment. But before I could even reach the restaurant, my lawyer Robert rang with an urgent tone that turned my anticipation into dread. And what he told me, about Daniel inquiring into my will, about questions regarding mental competency clauses, felt like a cold knife carving away whatever trust I had left. And by the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, I carried more fear than love in my chest, though I still tried to keep routine alive with coffee and my evening paper, until the sound of the front door slamming like a shotgun shattered the fragile calm, and Daniel stormed into the house without knocking, his polished shoes pounding against the wooden boards Clara and I had refinished decades earlier, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd been pacing for hours in a car rehearsing the rage he unloaded, demanding money, demanding I sell the old house in Cambridgeport and give him his share. And as I rose from my reading chair, steadying myself against the flood of memories of teaching that same boy to ride a bike on this very street, walking him proudly down the aisle at his wedding, I still offered to make coffee, clinging to dignity and civility. But Daniel swept away the offer with the kind of cruel dismissal that cut deeper than his words, telling me I was going to die soon anyway. So what need did I have for such a large house? Words that cracked the air like gunfire because they came from the same mouth I once praised for spelling his first word. And when I finally found the strength to tell him to get out, quietly but with finality, pointing to the door as my finger trembled with both fury and sorrow, he spat venom about me rotting alone in a nursing home before slamming the door hard enough to rattle the framed photographs of birthdays, graduations, and holidays we once cherished. And as I sank back into my chair, the silence felt like an alien weight pressing down, the house no longer my sanctuary but contaminated with his greed. And when I drifted toward the mantel where photographs of his milestones stood in neat rows, I traced the silver frames with fingers that remembered every sacrifice. $68,000 for college tuition at Northeastern, $15,000 I gave for his wedding to Clara, $25,000 for the first house they bought in Somerville, $30,000 for a doomed consulting business, countless smaller gifts, over $200,000 across decades, not loans but unconditional offerings of a father's love. And yet he had demanded more, as if my entire life's work and the home Clara had made beautiful was nothing but an obstacle to his financial hunger. And that night, as the grandfather clock chimed 8, I sat in the darkness replaying the cruelty, asking myself again and again where I had gone wrong, whether grief after Clara's passing had blinded me to the gradual corrosion of Daniel's soul, until the phone rang the next day with his voice suddenly soft, apologetic, asking me to meet him at the refectory, the restaurant where Clara and I had celebrated anniversaries for a decade, promising to make amends. And though suspicion twisted in me, I still agreed because loneliness weighs heavier than reason. And as I shaved, dressed in my navy suit with Clara's favorite blue tie and the silver cufflinks her parents had given me, hope returned like a fragile flame. But Robert's urgent message just before I left, warning me again that Daniel had been prying about contesting my will, pulled me back to icy doubt. Yet I decided I would still go, determined not to be intimidated, telling myself I'd eat or drink nothing until I knew the truth. So I drove through familiar Boston streets, past the pharmacy, the newsstand, the barbershop, past the landmarks of a life built with integrity, until I reached the Gothic-style restaurant glowing warmly in the dusk, where Daniel and Clara greeted me with open arms and rehearsed smiles, guiding me to a table by the window with wine already breathing. Wine Clara and I had once shared together, and though Robert's warning echoed in my mind, their attentiveness chipped at my defenses as they filled my glass, served my favorite dishes, spooned extra sauce on my plate, and spoke of family, of children they hoped to have, of rebuilding ties, until the rich taste of Cabernet dulled my suspicions, and by dessert I allowed myself to believe reconciliation was real. But when I returned home humming softly with windows rolled down, only to collapse hours later with nausea, stabbing stomach pains, violent vomiting, realizing with horror that Robert had been right and that my son had tried to kill me, every memory of the dinner twisted into evidence, the wine, the sauce, the insistence on second helpings, And as I clutched the phone to gasp out to 911 that I'd been poisoned, as sirens grew louder and flashing lights painted the walls Clara once decorated, I understood with clarity sharper than pain. My own son Daniel, the boy I'd once lifted on my shoulders to watch July fireworks over the Charles River, had plotted my murder for inheritance. And though the paramedics carried me through the night toward Mount Auburn Hospital, and though Dr. Patel later explained the poison, ricin, deliberate, lethal, I lay staring at white ceiling tiles, no longer a father dreaming of reconciliation, but a survivor of attempted patricide, resolved that my trust had nearly killed me and that Daniel would soon learn the difference between a weak old man and a father who had survived war, built bridges that still carried thousands, buried his beloved wife, and endured more than greed could ever destroy. So when I stepped into the Boston Police Department days later with discharge papers and toxicology reports under my arm, telling Detective Sarah Mitchell that my son had poisoned me at dinner, spreading hospital documents across a scratched interview table under the hum of fluorescent lights, my voice did not waver because the man who had entered that restaurant, seeking family, had died with the first glass of wine, and in his place stood a father who would see justice done, even if it meant sending his only child to prison. Detective Mitchell leaned back in her chair, her pen tapping softly against the notepad as she studied me, perhaps searching my tired eyes for exaggeration. But when she saw the trembling stack of medical records, the toxicology report stamped, with Mount Auburn's seal and the detailed log Robert had advised me to keep, dates, calls, the reconciliation dinner, even the strange aftertaste of the wine, she finally nodded, though she warned me that cases like this were slippery because family ties muddied motives and juries often resisted believing a child capable of patricide. Yet as I described the sensation of my throat burning, the spasms in my stomach, and the cruel words Daniel had hurled in my living room just days before, I could see her professional distance giving way to grim concern, and she promised to assign a forensics team to examine the restaurant utensils and request surveillance footage from the refectory. And though I thanked her, walking out into the gray drizzle of Tremont Street felt like stepping into another reality, one where my son was no longer my blood but my enemy. And as I drove back to my house, past familiar brownstones and bookstores, I caught sight of a father walking his young boy across the street, holding his hand tightly against the rush of traffic, and a wave of grief nearly forced me to pull over, because I remembered walking Daniel to elementary school on Columbus Avenue, teaching him to stop, look both ways, to trust me as protector. And now that same boy had laced poison into my glass, and I kept asking the steering wheel as if it could answer. What rot had grown in him, what hunger had replaced his heart? Was it greed? Was it Clara's influence? Or was it some flaw in me as a father? Yet by the time I turned the key in my front door, I knew questions would not undo what was done. And the smell of Clara's lavender potpourri still faint in the hallway reminded me that I had a duty to protect her memory, to protect the home she loved from being carved up by Daniel's schemes. So I began locking everything away. Financial, records, property deeds, insurance papers, Clara's jewelry, into a fireproof safe. And I spent the night pacing from room to room with a baseball bat leaning against my chair, imagining Daniel, returning not with apologies but with force, and sleep did not come. Only the steady tick of the grandfather clock counting down the seconds of a father's shattered trust, until dawn finally spilled pale light over the curtains and I forced myself to call Robert again, explaining every detail of the poisoning, and he, ever pragmatic, advised me to draft an addendum to my will immediately, placing Daniel's share into a trust locked with conditions he could never meet. And though it tore me apart to sign papers that essentially disinherited my own flesh and blood, my hand did not shake as I wrote my name because betrayal had already buried sentiment. And later that afternoon, as I stood by Clara's grave in Mount Auburn Cemetery, rain dampening my overcoat, I whispered to her marble headstone that I was sorry for raising a son who had turned into something she would never recognize, but also that I would not allow Daniel to win, not with money, not with power, not with my life. And in that moment the cemetery bells tolled faintly in the distance, echoing like a vow across the quiet rows of graves. And when I left flowers at her name, I felt a flicker of resolve, a survivor's strength returning. For if Daniel thought me weak, he would learn that even in my 70s my will was iron, forged through decades of work on Boston's bridges and skyscrapers, through wars of industry and grief, and now directed against the very man who bore my name. And as evening fell again, I received a call from Detective Mitchell telling me surveillance footage had indeed captured Daniel slipping something from his pocket into his palm just before raising his glass to toast, and though the angle was grainy and the motion subtle, combined with my hospital records and witness testimony from the waiter who noticed Daniel insistently pouring my wine, it was enough to move forward, and she promised that within days a warrant would be prepared. And hearing those words, I felt both relief and sorrow braided together, because no father ever dreams of watching his child in handcuffs. Yet justice demanded no less. And as I sat back down in my living room, staring once more at the family photographs that now felt like relics of a false past, I realized the story of Columbus, the father, had changed forever. No longer the tale of a man who gave endlessly to his son, but of a man who had survived that son's attempt to erase him, and who would now, in these twilight years, stand not only for himself, but for every parent who ever wondered how love could be twisted into greed so dark it sought to silence the very heart that had once beat for its child. The morning after Detective Mitchell's call lingered in my bones with a tension I had not felt even during my toughest years supervising construction projects on the Charles River bridges, because back then I had dealt with steel, concrete, and schedules, solid things, predictable things. But now I was navigating betrayal that had no blueprint, and as I brewed black coffee in Clara's old porcelain mug with the faded floral pattern, I found myself staring out at the garden she once tended, the roses long gone to weeds. And it struck me that just as those flowers had withered from neglect, so too had Daniel's spirit. Though unlike the roses, he had chosen his decay, watering it with greed until it strangled every good root. And the thought filled me with such sadness that I nearly spilled the coffee, yet I steadied my hand because I knew weakness was precisely what Daniel was counting on. And when the doorbell rang unexpectedly around 9 o'clock, my stomach dropped as though the poison had returned. But instead of Daniel's face, it was Robert arriving in his crisp gray suit with a leather briefcase, his expression grave but supportive. And he stepped into the living room as though he already knew the air here was heavy with memories and danger. And he sat opposite me at the oak table where Clara once hosted Sunday dinners, spreading out legal documents, trusts, codicils, amendments to the will, explaining line by line how we would lock everything down so Daniel could not touch a dime, until after my death, and even then, only if certain moral clauses were satisfied, clauses that Robert worded so carefully it was clear Daniel would never pass them, such as requirements of clean criminal record, proof of charitable work, and psychiatric evaluations. And while Robert spoke in his measured legal cadence, I could not help but remember the times Daniel had sat at this same table as a boy, coloring with crayons, building Lego towers, laughing with Clara as she baked apple pie, and the contrast between that innocent child and the man now plotting my death struck me so forcefully that I had to excuse myself to the washroom, gripping the sink and staring into the mirror where the lines of age etched deep across my forehead reminded me of battles survived, and I whispered to my reflection that I would survive this too, even if it meant standing utterly alone. And when I returned to the table, Robert had already drafted a restraining clause that would allow me to file for a protective order should Daniel attempt to contact me, something that at first felt too harsh, too final. But as Robert reminded me of the poison coursing through my veins only days earlier, I realized that harshness was simply realism, and I signed with a hand steadier than I expected, the pen scratching across paper like a quiet declaration of war, a war not fought with fists or guns, but with the strength of truth and the machinery of justice. And as Robert packed his briefcase and clasped my shoulder with a rare gentleness, promising that the wheels were already in motion with the district attorney, I felt both fortified and hollow. Fortified because action was underway, hollow because every stroke of legal protection against Daniel was also a stroke severing the bond of fatherhood I had cherished for decades. And when Robert left, the silence of the house returned, echoing through the hallways like the hush of a church after Mass, and I walked through each room deliberately, the kitchen where Clara once hummed, the dining room with its mahogany table scarred by years of family meals, the den where Daniel once sprawled watching baseball, and in each room I whispered farewells, Not because I was leaving, but because I no longer recognized these spaces as sanctuaries. They had been violated by betrayal, poisoned just as surely as the wine. And so that night I slept in the study with the safe beside me, the baseball bat across my knees, and the curtains drawn tight. And even though exhaustion pressed me into uneasy dreams, I awoke at 3 a.m. with my heart racing because I thought I heard footsteps outside, the crunch of gravel in the driveway. And though it turned out to be nothing but the wind rattling branches, I realized then that fear had embedded itself into my marrow, transforming my own home into a battlefield where shadows carried menace. And by dawn I resolved that I could not live in fear any longer, that I would confront Daniel, not to reconcile, but to deliver him the truth he had tried to bury with poison, the truth that he had failed, that I still lived, that his father was stronger than his hatred. And so I dressed deliberately in my oldest work boots, the ones stained with cement, from bridge pylons, and my thick wool coat, the one Clara used to tease me about for being too heavy, and I drove across Boston toward Somerville where Daniel and Clara lived, the city waking around me with joggers along the Charles, students with backpacks heading to Harvard Square, the ordinary rhythm of life mocking the storm inside me until I pulled onto their quiet street lined with maple trees beginning to yellow in the autumn air. And I parked directly in front of their house, the same house I had once helped finance with $25,000 pulled from my retirement savings, and I sat for a long moment staring at the windows glowing with morning light, remembering the day they moved in, how Clara had carried in plants and laughed about the creaky porch, and how Daniel had shaken my hand firmly, thanking me with eyes that back then seemed honest, but now those same windows hid a man who had plotted to kill me. And as I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching under my boots, I felt not fear but a steady determination. And when Daniel opened the door, clearly shocked to see me standing there alive, his face paled as if he had seen a ghost. And in that moment, though I said nothing, I knew he understood that his plan had failed. And the silence between us was heavier than words, heavier than years, heavier even than poison. A silence that carried all the weight of a father's love turned to stone, and a son's ambition turned to ashes. And when I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, final. You tried, Daniel, but I am still here, and the law is coming for you. Daniel's lips quivered as though he wanted to speak, to deny, to excuse. But the weight of my words pinned him, and for a long moment we stood like statues at the threshold of the very house I had once helped him buy, and I thought of how life is cruelly circular, how the same porch where I once embraced him as a proud father now served as the place where I confronted him as an enemy. And then Clara appeared behind him, her eyes widening at the sight of me alive, her face draining of color, because she, too, must have assumed the poison would have finished its job, and in that instant, I saw everything. Her complicity in her silence, the way she looked from me to Daniel like a partner in crime rather than a spouse horrified at his actions. And, though I could have shouted, could have struck him, could have cursed the day he was born, I simply turned away and walked back toward my car. For I knew that the wheels of justice were already grinding forward, and that nothing I said in anger could match the power of handcuffs and a judge's gavel. But as I pulled away, I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror of Daniel sinking onto the porch step, burying his face in his hands, and for a fleeting second a father's instinct stirred in me to comfort him, to say we could mend this. But then my stomach tightened with the phantom pain of the poison he had poured for me, and that instinct died as swiftly as it rose, replaced by the steely reminder that survival sometimes means severing the deepest ties. And when I returned home, still trembling from the confrontation, the phone was already ringing, and Detective Mitchell's firm voice informed me that a warrant had been issued and that officers would be at Daniel's residence within the hour, and she urged me to remain at my house for safety, promising updates as soon as they had him in custody. And I thanked her, though as I hung up, my knees gave way and I sank into Clara's old armchair, realizing that justice was no longer an idea but an inevitability. Yet the cost of that justice was the life of my son as I had known him, for whatever remained after prison would be a shell, a man defined not by family but by conviction. And hours later, as the sun bled orange across the Boston skyline, Detective Mitchell arrived at my door, her trench coat damp from rain, and she confirmed in a tone both professional and sympathetic that Daniel had been arrested without resistance, that Clara had screamed but not interfered, that he had been transported to Suffolk County Jail pending arraignment, and as she detailed the process, charges of attempted murder, solicitation of poisoning, conspiracy, I listened in silence, nodding. But inside me, two rivers collided. One of grim satisfaction that justice was real, the other of unbearable grief that the boy I had once rocked to sleep was now behind steel bars. And when she left, I wandered again through the house like a ghost, touching the banister Clara once polished, the books Daniel once scattered across, the floor as a teenager, and I whispered to the walls that though this house had seen betrayal, it would also see resilience, and that I, Columbus, would not be destroyed by the treachery of my blood. And the next morning the newspapers carried the story. Boston man accused of poisoning father for inheritance. The headline splashed across the metro section with a grainy photo of Daniel being led in handcuffs, head bowed, suit rumpled, and as neighbors eyed me with a mixture of pity and curiosity when I fetched the paper from the driveway, I realized my private hell had now become public spectacle. But instead of shame, I felt a strange pride. Pride that I had not hidden, pride that I had spoken truth. And in the days that followed, the court hearings began, slow and grinding. And each time I sat in the cold wooden benches of Suffolk Superior Court, I watched Daniel brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit, chains rattling at his wrists. And though he never looked directly at me, I studied his face, trying to reconcile the man accused with the boy I once cradled. And sometimes at night I would dream of him as a child again, tugging at my sleeve, asking for ice cream, asking for bedtime stories, and I would wake drenched in sweat, my heart torn between love and hatred, between memory and reality. And still, when the prosecutor laid out the evidence, the surveillance video of Daniel slipping powder from his pocket, the toxicology results confirming ricin in my system, the waiter's testimony about his insistence on pouring my wine, the financial records showing his desperation, I felt no doubt, no hesitation, only the cold certainty that my son had indeed tried to end my life. And as reporters swarmed outside the courthouse asking if I forgave him, I could only say, "Forgiveness is for those who repent. My son has not." And those words echoed across television screens, newspapers, radios, branding me as a father, both brave and broken. And though the trial stretched on for weeks, though Clara testified with rehearsed tears claiming ignorance, though Daniel's defense attorney painted him as a stressed man desperate for financial stability, the truth sat like granite in my chest. He had chosen greed over blood, and when the jury finally filed back into the room after 3 days of deliberation, when they pronounced him guilty on all counts, a hush fell over the courtroom so heavy it seemed even the walls held their breath. And I, Columbus, sat unmoving as if carved from stone, because though justice had triumphed, my heart was already a tomb where the son I once loved had been buried. And later that night, as I stood once again by Clara's grave under the pale light of the cemetery lamps, I whispered to her that our story had ended in tragedy, but that I had survived. And survival itself was a kind of victory, one she would have wanted for me. And as I turned to leave, the wind swept through the trees like her voice, soft and sorrowful, and I realized that though I was alone in blood, I was not defeated. For within me still burned the iron will of a man who had given everything and lost everything, yet remained standing, and that perhaps was the greatest inheritance of all. Not wealth, not property, but resilience, the unyielding refusal to fall, even when betrayed by the very flesh of your flesh. When the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, I remained seated, staring at the grain of the polished oak table where so many verdicts had been written before, and though everyone else moved, lawyers whispering, reporters rushing out, jurors adjusting coats, I sat still because my soul had not caught up with the moment, and I kept seeing Daniel not as a man in chains, but as the boy in his Cub Scout uniform clutching my hand at his first campfire, asking me if monsters were real, and I had told him no, monsters were only in stories. Yet here I was decades later realizing the cruelest truth, that monsters are born from within, and sometimes they bear your own last name, And as I finally stood, joints stiff from hours of stillness, I heard Clara's sob echo faintly in memory, the way she had once wept with joy when Daniel graduated, and now those tears seemed twisted into the cries of a mother betrayed from the grave. And stepping outside the courthouse, the flash of cameras nearly blinded me. Microphones thrust forward, voices demanding, "Mr. Columbus, do you feel justice was served? Do you still love your son? What will happen to the family estate?" And though every question stabbed, I forced my voice steady as I answered only once. Justice is not victory. It is survival. And yes, he is still my son, but he is also my would-be murderer. And those words exploded across every evening, broadcast painting me as both a symbol of endurance and a cautionary tale. And in the weeks that followed, as sentencing loomed, the loneliness of my home grew unbearable. Every hallway whispering memories, every creak reminding me of what had been lost, so I filled the hours pacing, cleaning, cataloging old photographs, writing letters to Clara as if she were still alive, pouring out my confusion and sorrow in long pages I stored in a locked drawer, letters that admitted truths I never spoke aloud. That part of me wished the poison had succeeded, not out of despair but out of exhaustion, because surviving betrayal sometimes feels heavier than death itself. But each dawn I rose again, fueled by something stubborn, something defiant, the same fire that had carried me through years of labor when my back ached and the city still needed bridges. And when the day of sentencing arrived, I sat in the courtroom once more, watching as Daniel was led in, shackled, thinner now, eyes hollow, his arrogance worn down into something like despair, though when he glanced at me his gaze held not apology, but accusation, as if I had betrayed him by living. And when the judge pronounced 25 years without parole, his shoulders slumped, but he did not break, and Clara's muffled sobs behind him only deepened the cavern of my grief. Yet I remained expressionless, because if I allowed tears they would drown me. And afterward, when the reporters swarmed again, I refused words, walking silently past them into the cold Boston air, the clang of the courthouse doors behind me sounding like the iron gate of a prison closing forever. Not only on Daniel, but on the life I once knew. And in the months that followed, I found myself drawn again and again to Mount Auburn Cemetery, not only to Clara's grave, but to wander among strangers' headstones, reading names and dates, imagining their stories, seeking comfort in the idea that every family carries tragedy, that mine was not uniquely cursed. And yet the weight never lifted, because betrayal by blood cuts differently. It festers like a wound that no salve can heal. And one night, unable to sleep, I drove past the prison where Daniel was held, the floodlights casting the compound in harsh white, barbed wire glinting, and I parked across the road watching the silhouettes of guards in their towers, and I thought of him in a cell, perhaps, staring at the same moon I saw, and for a moment I nearly wept, not for myself but for the boy he once was, the boy lost to greed, and I whispered into the night that I would always remember him as he was before, even if the man he became deserved every chain he bore. And slowly the months turned into years. The media's frenzy faded, neighbors' whispers quieted, but inside me the echo of that poisoned night never ceased, a drumbeat reminding me of mortality, of betrayal, of survival. And though I kept to myself, attending Sunday service, tending to Clara's roses, volunteering sometimes at the local library to read history to children, I always carried the scar, invisible but heavy, and sometimes the children would ask simple questions. Did you have kids? And though my throat would tighten, I always answered honestly, yes, one son, leaving out the rest because innocence should not be burdened with darkness. And at night, when I sat in my study with the baseball bat still leaning against the chair, not from fear now but from habit, I often thought of legacy, of what story my life told, and I realized that my name, Columbus, once tied to bridges and buildings, was now tied to betrayal and survival. But perhaps that was not failure, for survival itself is a kind of architecture, the building of strength upon ruins, the raising of iron beams where love once collapsed. And as I near the twilight of my years, I have come to accept that Daniel's betrayal will always define me. But it will not defeat me, because though poison coursed my veins and nearly silenced my heart, I am still here, breathing, speaking, remembering, And as long as I live, my truth lives too. A truth heavier than inheritance, heavier than blood. That a father's love is boundless, but even boundless love cannot save a son who chooses to become his father's executioner. And as the years rolled forward like a slow iron wheel crushing all softness beneath it, I found myself aging faster than I had expected, my body stiff with aches that no doctor could fully explain, though I suspected it was not illness but the invisible weight of memory pressing bone against bone. And yet I kept rising each morning, tending the roses Clara once loved, reading her Bible with its underlined verses, and writing letters to Daniel even though I never mailed them, pages filled with questions he would never answer, apologies he would never accept, and stories from my youth he had long since forgotten, and sometimes in the silence of night I imagined him reading them in his cell, imagined his hardened face cracking into the faintest smile, but reality always intruded, the knowledge that he would likely never smile at me again. For each time I visited him in prison, separated by thick glass and a telephone receiver sticky from countless hands, he would stare at me with that same coldness, speaking little, sometimes only asking about money or inheritance still locked away in legal trusts, never once about Clara, never once about my health, never once about the poison that nearly ended me. And those visits left me emptier than before, yet I kept going because some part of me refused to let the bond die completely, and the guards began to know me by name, nodding with pity as I shuffled past. And each time I drove away from the prison, I felt as though chains rattled in my own chest, chains that no key could break. And back in the city, life moved on without me. Neighbors moved out. Children grew into adults. Newspapers found new scandals, and yet my story lingered in the margins, occasionally revived by journalists writing retrospectives or filmmakers chasing documentaries. And though I refused most interviews, sometimes their words found me, labeling me the poisoned patriarch, a title that stung with grotesque irony, reducing my life's work and pain to a headline. And I wondered if Clara would have hated it or laughed at its cruelty. And one day I found myself watching a televised program where analysts dissected Daniel's motives, debating psychology, greed, family trauma, while I sat alone in my chair knowing the truth none of them could ever grasp. That betrayal cannot be charted in theories. It bleeds beyond logic. It corrodes the marrow of trust itself, and in that corrosion, even survival feels like defeat. Yet still I endured, because what else is there but endurance? And as my hands grew frailer, tremors beginning to show, I thought more of death. Not with fear, but with a kind of weary curiosity, imagining whether I would meet Clara again, whether she would forgive me for not protecting Daniel from himself, whether Daniel in another life might have been saved. And though such thoughts bordered on madness, I let them flow, because solitude breeds conversations with ghosts. And often at dusk, I would sit on the porch with Clara's old rocking chair beside mine, talking aloud as if she still sat there, telling her how the garden bloomed, how the neighbor's dog barked too much, how my knees ached worse in the rain, and always circling back to Daniel, asking her if she could see him, if she knew what he had become, if she still loved him in heaven despite the poison in his hands. And though no answer came, the rustling of leaves sometimes felt like a reply, and I would cling to that, frail as it was, because hope is the only antidote to betrayal. And still I endured, watching the world shift into modernity with its glowing screens and vanishing kindness, wondering if my story even mattered anymore to those rushing past. And then one winter evening, as snow fell thick and silent, I collapsed by the fire, breath stolen by age, and I realized the end might finally be near. And though fear tried to claw its way in, I whispered to myself that I had already survived the worst, that no death could wound me deeper than Daniel's betrayal. And in that realization I felt oddly calm. And as my vision dimmed, I thought of the boy in the Cub Scout uniform again, his hand in mine, asking if monsters were real. And I answered him in my heart, yes, son, monsters are real. And sometimes they are born from the ones we love most. But even then, love endures beyond the poison, beyond the chains, beyond the grave. And with that truth echoing through me like the last toll of a church bell, I let the silence take me, not as a victim but as a survivor who carried betrayal all the way to the end and still stood taller than the darkness that tried to consume him. Yet even after I was lowered into the earth beside Clara, my story did not end. For stories never die with the body. They ripple outward like stones dropped into water. And in the weeks after my passing, neighbors gathered in hushed tones outside my home, speaking of the old man who had survived poison from his own son. Some speaking with pity, others with awe, and the newspapers once more revived the tale, printing headlines that read, "Columbus the betrayed patriarch dies at 84. And though I could no longer read them, the words carried my ghost through the city like a shadow, and the estate lawyers began their work, sorting through letters, photographs, and the journals I had left behind, pages filled with memories of Clara, confessions of loneliness, reflections on bridges built and lives ruined. And soon scholars from universities requested access to those papers, eager to study the psychological depths of betrayal, to quote my sorrow as if it were literature. And though I could not protest, I wondered if they truly understood the blood that had stained those words. For my story was not meant to be dissected like a cadaver, but felt like an open wound. Yet, still the world consumed it. Documentaries aired with dramatic music, actors portraying me with grim expressions, my name etched into history not for my work on the city skyline but for surviving the poison of my own child. And meanwhile, Daniel remained locked behind bars, growing older, harder, his once sharp eyes clouded by years of confinement, and though he tried to fight against insignificance by writing manifestos from his cell, blaming me, blaming society, blaming fate. No one listened beyond the prison walls, and in time his voice faded, drowned by the louder tale of the father who endured, and inside the prison he became a cautionary figure whispered among younger inmates, a man who had tried to kill blood for gold and lost everything. And when he died in his bunk at 62, unattended, unremembered, his body claimed not by family but by the state, the guards who zipped the bag scarcely knew the full weight of the story they closed inside. Yet outside, in the city streets, my name lingered as a warning, told in classrooms, whispered in taverns, repeated in sermons about greed and betrayal, and my house became something of a landmark. Tourists pointing, guides saying, "Here lived the man poisoned by his son," and though the roses Clara once planted withered in time, new hands replanted them. Neighbors who never met us, still tending the soil out of respect, so that in every bloom her love and my endurance found rebirth. And I, though gone, still, walked in memory, not as a victim but as a testament that even the deepest betrayal cannot erase survival. And in this way my life stretched beyond its span, becoming legend, a story etched into the bones of the city, a story that would be told as long as fathers and sons existed, as long as trust could be broken, as long as love could endure poison and still whisper, "I survived." And yet the years did not bury the wound as deeply as some believed, for though the earth closed over my coffin and the roses grew wild above me, my name continued to ripple outward through generations, retold not only in Boston, but in distant towns where teachers used it as a moral lesson. Preachers thundered it from pulpits as proof that greed corrupts even the sacred bond of family, and authors twisted it into novels where fathers and sons clashed like kings and heirs of old. And though the details changed, the essence remained. The image of a son bending over his father's drink, the faint bitter taste of poison, the tightening chest, the collapse, and then the defiance of survival. And in that retelling, Daniel became a symbol not of man, but of monster. His name whispered in classrooms and courtrooms alike as the archetype of betrayal, while mine became a symbol of endurance, though I never sought such titles, and my journals, once stained with grief and trembling ink, were published by scholars who saw in my loneliness the anatomy of betrayal, printing thick volumes that students carried into libraries, annotating passages where I described Clara's laughter, my long nights of sorrow, my refusal to die even when death pressed hard against my lungs, and so my voice lived on, carried by strangers long after my bones turned to dust, and the city too transformed my tragedy into memory. Plaques erected near bridges I once designed, now bearing not only my name as engineer but a line beneath, "Survivor of a son's betrayal," a testament to human endurance. and though tourists read it quickly before moving on, some paused, imagining what it must have felt like, sipping wine at one's own table only to taste death in the glass, and those who paused carried the story onward, telling friends, weaving it into conversation until it became less a fact and more a legend. And Daniel, long gone in his unmarked grave, forgotten by kin and ignored by society, existed only as the villain of that legend, erased as a man, but immortalized as betrayal itself. And in prison lore his name became a warning, spoken to new inmates. Don't be like Miller. He tried to kill blood for gold and ended in chains. And even among criminals he was seen as cursed, for betraying blood was a line too far, a line that stripped him of respect even among thieves. And so the legacy of his crime became an exile, greater than prison bars, an exile from memory itself while mine endured, etched into sermons, into plaques, into whispered stories of caution. And perhaps that was the cruelest justice of all, that I, though broken, became immortal, while he, though ambitious, was erased. And still the story grew bigger than us, woven into plays, into poems, into late-night talk around tavern tables where someone always began, "Did you hear of the man whose son poisoned him for inheritance?" And from that point the story bent into myth. My name blurred, Daniel's name twisted, Clara's sorrow dramatized, until in some versions I was a king in a castle, in others a poor farmer, in others an old judge, but always the heart remained, a son's betrayal and a father's survival. And perhaps that is all legacy truly is, the distillation of pain into something so sharp it cuts through centuries. And even if time erases the details, it cannot erase the wound itself, the eternal warning carved into humanity. Beware of poison at your own table. Beware of monsters born from love. Beware of trust too easily given, yet also remember that survival is possible, that even in the face of betrayal, a heart may beat on. And so though I am gone, though Daniel is gone, though Clara's tears have long dried, our story will live in whispers and warnings as long as fathers and sons walk this earth, as long as greed festers in dark corners, as long as love is strong enough to endure even poison. And so the story did not end even as centuries shifted, for betrayal of blood is a tale that never dies. And my survival, my sorrow, my journals, and Clara's roses became part of the city's marrow, until school children who never saw my face were taught my name as though it were carved in scripture, their teachers pointing to faded photographs of my weary frame, telling them that trust can be both a fortress and a blade. And in time, historians dug deeper, unearthing not only the trial records but my letters unsent to Daniel, publishing them in bound volumes that spread across the globe, translated into languages I never spoke, so that men and women in countries far from Boston read my pain as if it were their own, and some wept, some hardened, some wrote dissertations, some wrote songs, until my voice, once cracked by loneliness, grew louder than it had ever been in life, while Daniel's dwindled to a whisper of shame. And though the prison where he had died was eventually demolished, the ground remembered, and locals spoke of restless echoes, of footsteps in empty corridors, of cold drafts passing through barred ruins at night, whispering curses in his name. And the prison became a ghost story too, tied to him as my bridges were tied to me, until Boston itself seemed divided between two legacies, the father who built and endured, and the son who destroyed and perished. And yet even outside Boston the tale carried, passed into folklore, where storytellers embroidered it into campfire, warnings and stage tragedies, reshaping it with every telling. And in some distant versions Daniel was painted not only as villain but as tragic, a man devoured by greed too young to master it. And though they tried to soften him, the core of betrayal never disappeared, and still my endurance overshadowed him. And centuries later, when scholars debated the psychology of betrayal, my case remained on their lips, my journals quoted as primary evidence, my name invoked whenever history needed to remind the world that poison does not always kill, that survival sometimes becomes the sharpest blade of all. And though my body was long, dust, my spirit seemed to linger in every retelling, in every whispered warning before a toast was drunk, in every sermon where a preacher warned, even blood can betray you, in every tear of a mother who feared her child might grow twisted by greed, and in every silent vow of a father who swore to protect his son from the shadows within. And so I, Columbus, betrayed yet unbroken, lived far longer than my years, carried in ink, in stone, in memory, in myth, and perhaps even in eternity itself, for betrayal is as old as Cain and Abel, yet so too is survival. And I, through poison and sorrow, became both wound and witness, both scar and scripture. And, as long as fathers and sons walk the earth, so too will my story walk beside them, never ending, never forgotten, never silenced. And thus the story which began in the quiet clink of a poisoned glass and the silent gasp of a betrayed father, now ends not with triumph or defeat, but with endurance. For though Daniel's name rotted into silence and Clara's tears dried into the soil of graves long tended, my survival carved itself into memory, into ink, into legend, and long after I lay down in dust, the world still carried the echo, whispering of the father who outlived poison and the son who chained himself to ruin. A story stretching across generations as both warning and testament, proving that even the deepest betrayal cannot silence a heart that refuses to stop beating. And now as you, the listener, reach this final breath of the tale, let it linger not as sorrow but as strength. For survival is not only mine but yours too. If ever betrayal darkens your door, and if this story struck you, shook you, or stayed with you even for a moment, then carry it forward, share it, and let it live again. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell so you never miss another tale of shadows, betrayals, and survival, because more stories await. And this was only one flame in a world of fire.